Hi, I'm Dave Gardy from Maritime TV for another ballast water treatment report from our studios here near Washington, D.C. And joining me right now from New Haven, Connecticut is Steve Candito, CEO of Ecochlor. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dave, for having me. It's good to see you again.
Now, there's a lot going on with the small vessel general permit. A lot of things happening there where extensions are no longer applicable and even vessels under 79 feet have to comply. Just give us a rough overview of what's going on there.
Yeah, well, this is a very important topic right now because there had been so many regulatory delays and extensions. I think this one might have crept up on some of the smaller vessel owners, workboat owners, when there was not a further extension back in December. And so these regulations have come into force as of January 19th of this year. And the owners are required to comply with all of these incidental discharge requirements, including ballast water. And many times the owners don't realize that ballast water is included with the other incidental discharges that might come off the vessel, such as the gray water from their showers and their sinks and things.
So another complication is this is overlapping regulations, and there's some legislation afoot to try to address that, drafted. Can you give us a perspective on that?
Yeah, so first of all, on the overlapping regulations, I mean, I really feel for the owners in these situations because you obviously have the federal Coast Guard regulations, which are the ones that most vessel owners are familiar with and are expecting to deal with. But in this water area, you also have the Environmental Protection Agency that has their own rules and requirements. And sometimes there are some conflicts between what the EPA is looking for and what the Coast Guard is outlining. And then there's a third element here in that the states can get involved in regulating these issues as well. Generally, it's the West Coast states like California and Washington and the Great Lakes states like Michigan, for example. So there's this myriad of regulatory requirements that the owners have to deal with regard to these discharges coming off the vessels. And the proposed solution has been a federal overriding statute. The proposal was something called CVIDA, the Commercial Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. And many of the industry have been trying to get this legislation passed for a long, long time now. But just recently, it finally made it out of the Senate Commerce Committee, which is as far as it's ever gotten before. And it's now in the Coast Guard appropriations bill. So there is a good chance that that could get passed and simplify things for vessel owners.
And just specifically, if it does get out of committee, or it is out of committee, but it finally gets voted on, what will be the benefits for vessel owners once it's in place?
Yeah, so I should have made that clear. What CVIDA basically says is that the federal regulation the federal regulation applies, and within the federal regulation, they mean the Coast Guard. So it will take the EPA out of regulating these discharges, and it will also take the states out of regulating these discharges. And interestingly, to some extent where we've seen some opposition to this rule or to this proposal, it's been from the states where they think they're losing some ability to control these things, which maybe to some extent they are. But when you read some of the commentary, it implies that there is no regulation, which is not true. It's just that the Coast Guard standard will apply. It's not that no standard would apply.
Now, on the EPA VGP side, the one that was approved in 2013, that's expiring in December of 2018. What should we be concerned about there for vessel owners?
Yeah, so again, this creates uncertainty, and that's where the CVIDA legislation might add some clarity to this. So right now, not the Coast Guard, but the EPA is required to update those VGP requirements. And they've been telling us for literally a year or more now that they're going to have the proposed new regulations out for the industry to comment on. We first heard that they would be out last summer, then they were going to be out in the fall, then sometime early this year. We still have not seen them yet the deadline to actually start implementing them is the end of the year. So if we get those regulations out or the proposed regulations out soon, then that'll give the industry some time to comment, hopefully get something that's workable. But if the EPA waits much longer, we're not going to have much time to comment on these things before they're really required to become into effect early next year.
Now, one of the compliance things is the laboratory testing of the ballast water, and there are laboratories that are popping up now that are going to be able to do this and have vessel owners comply. But isn't it an issue of how close they are to a port, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the industry is very concerned about this, and somewhat rightfully so, although I think it's manageable. So one of the reasons why, or the proximity to the lab to where the sample needs to be taken from the ship is, there's a couple of reasons. From the owner's perspective, he wants to get somebody that's nearby to keep it cost effective. Obviously, if you're very far away, there's travel costs. Maybe even you have to stay overnight in a hotel to make sure you're there in time to meet the ship. So the fact that there's a lab close to where the ship is going to keep the costs under control for the owners. On the regulatory compliance side, there are some time limitations on how quickly the water has to be tested. So if the lab is too far away, then you'd have extra precautions that you'd have to take to keep the water at certain temperatures and those kinds of things, because they're literally testing whether organisms are living or not. And if you put that sample under some stress and strain, that may end up killing organisms that otherwise would have been alive. So the fact that these labs need to be close to where the ships are coming and getting the samples is important. But basically, there are labs all around the country, and as long as the ship owner is being proactive in setting this up ahead of time and not trying to call, literally an hour before you need it, most of the testing labs can work these details out.
Now, the other challenge, too, for ship owners is that the ballast water treatment systems themselves have to be constantly monitored to make sure they're operating properly. What are the concerns there?
Yeah, well, this is, in a sense, sort of a benefit for the owners in that the Coast Guard has made it very clear that they expect the systems to be used, they expect the crew to be trained on them, but they're not at the point where they're physically testing the ballast water to see that it's actually meeting the requirements. So it's more of a paperwork exercise right now. Does the crew know where the manual is? Does the crew know how to turn the system on? Is the crew filling out the logbook correctly? Those are the kinds of things that the Coast Guard or the port state control officials will be checking. And as long as the crew is doing those basic things, they're going to be fine for now. It'll be some much later stage where they would physically test water to see if the system is actually killing the organisms.
And it's not just ballast water we're talking about here. There's 27 discharges, is that right?
That's true. So, I mentioned something like gray water, your showers and your sinks, as well as ballast water, but there's any number of other incidental discharges. Many fishing vessels get caught up in this small vessel general permit. They have effluent from the fish processing procedures. Those kinds of things can get caught up in this. Certainly, lubricants from various machinery, your bilge water is caught up in this. So these are all different discharges that are regulated.
So I guess it's a big challenging time to try to implement these systems, especially when freight rates are down and vessel operators have to make the decision. I guess the solution is just planning, right?
That is the key. I mean, I've said this many times before. I think I mentioned it even in our first series here, is if you can be proactive and plan things out, you can make it much more cost effective, and you can make it much more comfortable for you and the crew. It really becomes a problem when you wait to that last minute, you're scrambling around, and that's when things cost more, and that's when mistakes get made. So planning is the key.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate the time you've taken for this ballast water treatment report, Steve, and we'll keep an eye on all these things relative to the VGP and the sVGP. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dave, for having me.
I'm Dave Gardy here for the Ballast Water Treatment Report, number 3 in a series from Maritime TV studios near Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us.